We're not talking with a microphone, so I hope you can hear me. I'd like to talk about inspiration, something that we all think about as writers. I've often been asked where I find my inspiration for writing a thriller novel. I often blame my perceived mental illness as part of my answer. Besides being a former patient of a few therapists, I'm also a certified card-carrying, dues-paying insomniac. A good night's sleep for me would be one without any terroristic demons, Satan worshippers, demagogues, or monsters from a past life or a prior marriage. I've often looked for other sources or other forms of inspiration through different forms of media. These sources could be newspapers, news stories, biographical movies, or even televised crime stories. My ideas may come from a Dateline murder story or a biographical story of a murder suspect. My ideas may come from another book about a famous mobster or an unsolved murder. All these concepts become twisted and rearranged in my mind when I write my storylines. My last 3 books are products of my vivid imagination, my discrete mental illness, and many intense nightmares and many sleepless nights of the past. My novel, They Only Wear Black Hats, which was released in 2021, is about a secret association of businessmen who call themselves the Militia Society of Detroit, or the Archangels as they call themselves. They are successful members of society who are frustrated with the judicial system, where alleged murderers are either dismissed on a technicality, exonerated, or given lenient sentences by the court system. They then hire out their own stable of executioners who strangle these acquitted murderers, leaving a bowler black hat at every crime scene. My protagonist, Detective Mike Palazzola of Detroit's 3rd Precinct, discovers this secret society and knows exactly who they are, but there is nothing that he can do to apprehend them. My novel, Contracts for Sale, which was released in October 2022, is about an elite corporation of professional assassins called Eradication Inc. They are in the business of accepting contract assignments and performing the perfect murder without a trace for a cash price of $99,900. Paul Crawford is a newspaper reporter who was asked to investigate the disappearance of various businessmen whom he calls the Houdini victims. There's never any physical evidence, and these victims disappear without a trace. Things start getting sticky when their CEO, Mark Stelter, threatens his shareholders with their demise should they ever reveal their identities and the nature of their business. In my most recent novel, Dinner at Tony Napoli's, which will be released in the next few weeks, is about a restaurant owner named Tony Sorrentino. He's an 87-year-old lung cancer patient who decides to sell his restaurant to a land developer after being in business for over 55 years. It is a popular place where famous celebrities, politicians, and Chicago mobsters often meet to have their chinetas. The outfit has often used his famous restaurant over the years as a backdrop for their initiation ceremonies, syndicate weddings, mafia funerals, planning of elaborate heists, and of course, mob hits. When the demolition crew finds 4 dead bodies buried underneath the basement of his restaurant, Tony Sorrentino is immediately arrested. Knowing that he doesn't have long to live, he invites his nephew, CPD Detective Dennis Romanowski, to visit him in jail and bear witness to his confessions from his many years of being of service to the Chicago outfit. In all 3 of these recent novels, my active imagination, along with my various psychoses, contribute to my writing and the composition of these thriller fiction novels. I have to say that sometimes even my active imagination can't always assist me in completing these storylines and writing these stories of fiction. Like you, as a writer, I often struggle to put the chapters together in a chronological order that makes the storyline work and makes sense to the reader. Many times, I find myself struggling as much as many of you probably often do, and to that end, my creativity may come in many forms. My most recent novel, Dinner at Tony Napoli's, comes from my friendship with a current restaurant owner who has recently closed his restaurant, and it was always a gathering place for past and present wise guys. And my book, They Only Wear Black Hats, that was inspired by an old movie with Michael Douglas called Star Chamber, where various judges get together once a month and plan the murders of exonerated killers. And in Contracts for Sale, my inspiration for that story was on the 6 o'clock news where a businessman was recently kidnapped from a parking garage in downtown Chicago and disappeared without a trace. In all these instances, my inspiration for my stories can come from almost anywhere and almost anything. They say that imitation is the best form of flattery. In my case, imitating, variating, rearranging, adapting, emulating, and even mimicking are tools that I'm not afraid or ashamed to use. It is these tools that help us all formulate our creativity, and it can often come from many different forms. While I was writing one of my earlier novels, A Rose from the Executioner, about a serial killer who was murdering pedophile Catholic priests, I was watching continuous reruns of Chicago PD and modeled one of my antagonists after Hank Voight, a popular Chicago PD detective. I found a significant amount of detailed material that I needed to complete my storyline, and many of my scenes were taken from what I had seen on the television series. Another novel, Demons of Divine Wrath, is about a recent discovery of an old man, the son of a former Nazi officer, found dead in his Munich apartment. Hidden in his attic for the last 75 years are 42 paintings that were stolen by the Nazis in Florence's Uffizi Gallery in 1943. This is based on a news story of one actual discovery of a former Nazi who had stolen paintings stashed in his apartment. I've written 10 thriller novel fiction so far, and I can tell you that I have found different sources of inspiration for each and every one of them. It is never easy, and sometimes you have to be more than just creative to come up with a very good storyline. And it just can't be a storyline that will keep your interest for your readers, but your own interest as well. When you become immersed in your own storylines, this is when you can be the most creative in writing, modeling, and creating your novels. My best advice as a writer is not to be bashful to where or how you acquire your material. You're never a plagiarist, you're never a copycat, and you are certainly not a book thief. You are merely a fiction writer looking to inspire others from those authors, playwrights, poets, movie directors, screenwriters, and journalists who inspire you. And who knows, the next time you pick up your remote control, you might be inspired to write your next great novel. Thank you.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much, Ed. Our next author, following the CPA, we have a certified residential appraiser and a realtor. So we're heavy on business people. And this is the cover of his book. And he has Fox Deluxe beer being advertised here. And I don't know if everybody knows the story about Fox Deluxe beer. It was the Mob's brand in about 1954. And in our neighborhood and all of the places that sold beer, Fox Deluxe became the featured beer overnight, and it was a very big success until it wasn't. So I don't know if that's you go into that part, but God bless you for using that on your cover. So Tim Pareti, as I said, is originally a journalist for the Scripps newspapers and a freelance writer for the Trib, and he's currently a realtor and Illinois certified residential appraiser in Chicago. He's got a master and MS in journalism from Texas A&M. Welcome. This is your first time at Casa at Literati, isn't it?
It sure is, yeah.
Okay, well, welcome. And did you know that the Fox had 400 story?
I did not know that.
Oh, okay.
That's very interesting.
Well, you're advertising for the mob there.
Well, that's, I was going to talk about that. I can talk about that a little bit later. But thank you, Dominic, for having me, and thank you, everybody. This is my first rodeo, and I'm not really sure. This book came out last year, and this is my first presentation on the book.
Oh,
So I'm not sure where to go and what to do, but
you got
I'll
10
start
minutes.
from the top, right? What'd you say?
You got 10 minutes.
10 minutes, oh. All right, okay, well, I'll make it brief. My name is Tim Pareti, and I live in Evanston with my beautiful wife, Donna G. and Pietro Pareti, and my 2 kids and my 2 dogs. And so this story here, I wrote the story based on family stories over the years, and it all starts with my great-grandparents Ben and Flora Pareti, who were first generation Italian immigrants from Genoa. They came here and they bought property and land and buildings across the street from Wrigley Field in the early 20th century. In 1932, when Prohibition ended, my grandfather, their son, Ernie Pareti, built a makeshift hot dog stand on the property on Waveland and Sheffield across from the bleachers. And all through the Depression, they did very well, he and my grandmother, Margaret Pareti, and they saved enough money to build the tavern, which they called Ernie's Bleachers. And the story takes place in 1945 Chicago, when the Depression was ending, World War II was ending, and the Cubs were heading to the World Series. And let me read from the jacket here a little bit about the story. It takes place in 1945, as I said. And Eddie Pareti lives under the shadow of his older brother and sister, straight-A students who are the apple of their parents' eye. He's the black sheep of the family who dodges duties at his family's tavern, Ernie's Bleachers, now Murphy's Bleachers. He ditches school and fails 7th grade. The Cubs in 1945 are heading to the World Series, and Eddie sneaks into games and brushes up against baseball legends, including the stars of the Negro League, Joe DiMaggio, and a bookie, but he runs into trouble with a bookie who wants him to shoot a deadbeat gambler. He takes the mayor's car for a spin with his buddies, and hold your horses, he crashes a stagecoach on State Street. Eddie's Italian-American family, already battling Chicago machine politics and the mafia, think he's going astray. Fed up, his parents make a decision that will change Eddie's life. But street-smart Eddie has other plans, and thus begins a journey that takes him to places he's never been. He encounters a strange religious cult that plays baseball on donkeys and makes his home under the stars. Along the way, he learns a lifelong lesson about home, family, and responsibilities. Based on a true story, Ernie's Bleachers is a coming-of-age saga of baseball, family, and the American spirit that intersects on the corner of Sheffield and Waveland. A vintage tale that explores the classic era of the national pastime, the ravages of war, the end of the Depression, and the city of big bets and big shoulders. So, I spent several years researching this story through family stories, through newspaper clippings, through books I read, and some of the interesting things I learned, there was a rodeo at Wrigley Field, and in the story is Sid the Bull. If you could stay on Sid for 10 seconds, you win $1,000. And my research indicated that it was all kind of a scam, that no one was ever able to get on Sid. It was all the rodeo staff that were doing it. And it's interesting, Dominic, that you brought up this. I didn't know about Fox Deluxe, but the mob pressured my grandfather to take their jukebox, get rid of their
Oh,
jukebox,
yeah.
and take their jukebox.
Okay,
It
that was their other scam.
Right. It was a scam. They were going to all the taverns and forcing them to take their jukebox. If they didn't, they wouldn't have their bar.
Or the
Right.
Windows vibrators.
How did they pressure him?
Good question. You know,
Make an offer you couldn't refuse?
right? You know, smoke bombs. They would get people to pressure them not to go into the bar. Sometimes they rough up the bar owner and other things. Sometimes the bar would burn down. But most of the time, the bar owners, including my grandfather, knew that it wasn't worth fighting them because, you know, it didn't matter. You just take their jukebox. You know, it was the same deal. But the scam was that the mob wanted everyone to take their jukebox so they can launder the money through the jukeboxes. So I didn't know about the Fox Deluxe. I'll have to research that because perhaps, you know, that's was another little pressure that they forced my grandfather to take their beer and advertise their beer. I don't know.
There you go, another book.
Yeah. Another thing is they forced him to take the jukebox. Now my grandfather at the time was a precinct captain and he was connected to politics. And so he decided to run for alderman in the mid-1940s. And they were friends. And my grandfather only had a 6th grade education. And there was a conflict between my grandfather and my grandmother because, you know, they had the bar to run and Eddie was getting into trouble. And they were going to send him to military school, and that was going to cost a lot of money. And running for alderman was going to cost a lot of money. The mafia didn't want my grandfather to run for alderman because the current alderman was connected with the mafia, and he was their guy.
Who is that?
I knew you were going to ask. I should. I forget. You know, it's in the book.
Buy the book.
Buy the book. I forget off the top of my head, but they were friends. And my grandfather was kind of a cunning man. He used running for alderman as leverage to get a better deal because he was friends with the current alderman, and the current alderman wanted to get him to step aside and not run because he was going to siphon votes from him. So my grandfather decided not to run. He stepped away, and as a reward, he was given a job at the Parks and Rec department. He was on the city payroll. So, so let me read you some excerpts from the book, give you an idea of what's in there. So here's one. This is a former Cub player who decided not to take an offer the Cubs made him in the 1920s. And this is in rural Michigan at an amusement park, which was called the House of David. I don't know if you know about that. He runs across Eddie in Elmore. Eddie's running away from home. And this ball player works at the amusement park and realizes Eddie is running away from home. And he tells Eddie this: being on your own, away from home, is like being on base and taking a big lead. There's danger, risk. You can get picked off, or you can run into a double play. The only place you're really safe is when you're at home base. It's the only base in the ground like a foundation that's shaped like a home. Funny, in baseball, you start at home and you journey across the sacks trying to get back home. Home is where all the action is. You defend it, clean it, run to it, throw at it, step on it. Some try and steal it. All the important stuff happens at home. Here's another excerpt. This is when the alderman is trying to convince my grandfather not to run, to get out of the race because he's just not a politician. It's hard business being a politician. And he tells him this: politicians mix truth and lies as easily as a card shark shuffles clubs and spades. Another excerpt. This is in the bar. Kitty runs a dice game in the bar, and Walter is the bouncer, and Sailor is a barfly whose son is in the Navy, and Uncle Jimmy is a bookie. They're all sitting playing dice. Walter slapped the table. I think he's asking you out, Kitty. Oh, he's a foul ball, Kitty said with a teasing smile. You can't strike out on a foul ball, Uncle Jimmy said. Yeah, but you can't get on base neither, Kitty replied. Couple more here. Bobby is Eddie's older brother, and Bobby's trying to get Eddie to go upstairs and get ready for Mass. Eddie doesn't want to go to Mass. He wants to skip out. Think of going to church as going to a Cubs game. You sit in the pews or the bleachers listening to organ music. You stand, you sing, you watch the players and the priest and altar boys who are all dressed up in uniforms. You praise the Cubs or Jesus, right? It didn't work. Eddie skipped out. Let's see, a couple more here. This is a scene where Eddie's friend Elmore is going to his first game, Cubs game. And I don't know if you've ever gone to a Cub game, but if you're going up through the tunnel, it's dark until you get up there and you see the light. Elmore tramped up the steps as if he were sleepwalking. A cool breeze swept through his red hair, tousled like a flickering flame. He reached the top and froze, his lips parted in wonder. The infield was the color of golden sand. The outfield grass, a radiant green, looked like felt on a brand new billiard table, glowing in God's light. Here's a description of the neighborhood. This is a description of the tracks. Life under the L was a creepy, dark underworld, a rough and rugged region where sidewalk people didn't go, a no man's land where men fought for dibs to park cars, drunk Cub fans pissed behind steel beams, or bums dug through trash looking for God knew what. So anyways, I don't think I have much time left. This is my first book, my first novel. It took me about 1.5 years to write, about another year to edit and rewrite. I think it turned out pretty well. And does anyone have any questions?
How did you publish?
Self-published. I didn't want to wait for, I tried to look for literary agents,
Yeah.
and I didn't want to wait, it would have been years. I decided to self-publish, and it's been pretty good. The sales are okay, People seem to like it.
What's your next book?
Good question. I have several things on the iron, but one is a historical fiction that takes place in the late 1800s, involving the Haymarket Square and George Streeter. Yeah, Chicago based. I'm from Chicago, by the way. I grew up in the Lincoln Square neighborhood. So.
You said involving the Haymarket affair then?
Sort of. It's part of that, not directly, but yes, Chicago, late 1800s. So, in conclusion, my grandmother, when Ernie passed away, my grandmother told me that he knew more than most men. And at the time, he had a 6th grade education, and I knew he was smart and street smart, but that surprised me. In all my research, I realized he did. He knew all the angles. He worked through the Depression. He was successful during the Depression. He was successful handling all the politics. He was successful handling the mob. And he knew a lot of people, and he was the kind of guy that everyone liked. If you walked in, you would like him. But the story also involves my dad and his impetuous youth. And I see this book as a good summer read. It's a small story. There's not a lot of, car chases and murders and things like that. It's a coming of age novel. I got 1 minute left. And it's a good summer read, and that's all I got. Oh, one more thing. One of the characters in the book, true story, Lou Novikov, if you know who he is, he was a larger-than-life, colorful character, went into the bar, befriended my grandfather. He would attend bar every now and then after the game. He was a Cubs outfielder. He was the next Babe Ruth. but he drank a lot of alcohol. And
Yeah.
he had dinner with my family many times, and in one of those dinners, which is in the book, seen in the book, he gave my father this mitt, Ludnokov's mitt. They say he was afraid of the ivy. He thought it was poisonous. One of the coaches took him over there and rubbed the ivy all over him and said, "This is not poisonous, can't you see that?" And he goes, "Well, can you smoke it?" He was the kind of player that made tons of errors. They said that he would wrestle the ball to the ground, not catch it. I can see why. All right.
Very interesting.
Thank you.
Our next author is a prize winner. Christina Marracco from Elgin College professor. And she won the, New Independent Press Fiction from the Chicago Writers Association in 2022. So congratulations, Christina. And come up and tell us all about it.
I'm going to sneak up
Oh,
on this
there you
side. Here I am. Thank you, Dominic.
Okay.
Okay. So, yes, this book, it took me 6 years to write. I'm slow. And it is interlinked short stories, right? So each of the short stories ties to the others. You kind of end up at a novel in the end, but they're kind of small bites. It's like tapas reading. So it's just kind of easy to write in a way too, because you get to focus in. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about it because I really want to read from the book for you. I'm going to dip into 2 different chapters. The book is set between 1946 and 1966 in a fictitious neighborhood called Mulberry Park, which would be very similar to Melrose Park. But this is fiction, so it's in a fictional place. There are many characters, but the main character probably is the grandmother. She's in the first story heavily, and she's in the last story heavily. And it's kind of the arc of the end of her life that contains all of these stories. Her name is Giuseppa Millefiore. She rules with an iron fist. She's a widow, and she owns the buildings in which her children live. So that's something that you need to know. The first story that I'm going to read from is one of her grandchildren, her grandson. He's 13 and 7 months and 4 days old, and he is full of himself. He has figured out the world. He's been to Bughouse Square. He has determined that he is either agnostic or atheist, and he's very concerned about not sharing this secret with anyone. But the secret is burning him alive, right? It's like money in his pocket. So that's where we're going to start. And I need these nowadays, so here we go. And his name is Big John. This does not mean he's big, as you guys know. It just means that he's the first cousin named John, right? Big John parked his bike and came up her stairs onto her porch, where she patted the seat of the chair next to hers. She had a little blue plate of confetti waiting there for him, as if she knew he'd be passing by. Or maybe she just knew someone would, and he was the fly that got caught in her web. He took one of her candied almonds and wondered about her traps. After all, she had 6 sons and 12 grandchildren on the block. It was just a matter of time. Big John didn't want to talk about religion or atheism, not at all. But it seemed he couldn't stop himself. "You're not going to church tonight, Grandma?" he asked, hating how he parroted her broken English. But he couldn't stop himself from that either. He felt the round ball side of the geode, he carries a geode in his pocket, like protection from her. "No, not tonight. Too nice out." She pointed to the purple sky of the autumn day nearing evening, and the orange of the maples and the golden mulberry trees, and the sun setting behind them. The colors of impending sunset were mirrored in the sky out to the east, which they faced like moviegoers. Sometime I go Wednesday night. Sometime I no go. You go? No, Grandma, I no go. She nodded and urged him to take another almond, sweeping her hand across the sky and across the plate in one large arc, like an orchestra conductor, he thought. Her hands were strong and wrinkled, and her teeth were out, probably in the bathroom. Big John felt the candy shell crumble against his teeth. You my favorite, his grandma grunted. Tell me what it is bother you. I see you ride your bike. You ride here, you ride there, you ride here, you ride there, like dog with a bone, looking for un posto to bury it. Tell me the bone. No bone. Yes, bone. I'm an old woman. I know bone when I see. No bone, Grandma. Big John was starting to feel uncomfortable. Why you lie to Grandma? No trust, Grandma? No trust Grandma even though you favorites? His grandma rubbed her forehead hard with all her fingertips at once and dropped her head nearly into her lap. You break my heart, Giovanni. She looked truly miserable. Big John thought hard. Oh no, it was likely she would tell everyone how she knew he was afraid to say it, but she was observant. She'd have made a good journalist in another life, or in Sicily. She would tell everyone, and then they would pester him up and down the streets, from the youngest to the oldest, everyone trying to figure out what his secret was. And not just that. The things they'd suspect might stick, even if wrong. Those could be worse than the truth. He felt trapped. Her head was still down, and she looked like a small boulder. Okay, Grandma, he said. I'll tell you, but only if you swear it's between you and me. You can't tell nobody. I mean anybody. When she grinned, Big John knew he'd rightly sensed things. His grandma loved being the only one to know something, anything. He knew she went to great lengths to discover information, and that, everyone knew, was how she'd broken her hip long ago, climbing up on skids to look in a window to catch Aunt Lucy's husband gambling away the money for food. It was legend that Grandma had said it was worth the broken hip to get to the truth. Big John had heard this story by eavesdropping on adults when he was just 9, and he hadn't been forward enough to ask for the details. It was part of why he liked Grandma so much, despite her old silly ways. When his grandma agreed to the deal, he was not surprised, but he was terrified. Still, fear did not hold him back, and Big John laid out his atheist manifesto like a feast table before his elderly grandmother, breaking only to stuff more confetti into his anxious mouth, and it helped. She didn't interrupt him, but listened quietly, though he wasn't sure how much she really understood. She sure nodded a lot. She nodded through his definition. She nodded through his explanations. She nodded at all of his examples of injustice on earth and his recounting of all the dead people in the family up and down the street. He sweated a little in the cool breeze, and he looked her in the eye. To make sure he was understood, Big John recapped his stance at the end, saying as loudly as he could without anyone else on the block hearing, I think about everything, all of it, and there can't be a God. People just made the whole thing up to make themselves feel better. He said it with feeling, with emphasis, with surety, and with the kind of tears that come from a strange relief. He'd done it. And now, let come what may. They could excommunicate him from the family, send him away to a monastery, try to straighten him out. But it would never work. He waited for a slap, or to be dragged down the stairs and off to church at the very least. He waited, needing a drink from all the sugar seizing in his throat, for a keening, a shrieking, a fainting, a crumpled old grandma on the lawn below. Instead of any of these things, which he was prepared for, his grandma met him with a certain narrow-eyed conspiratorial look. She smiled broadly, showing all her gums, and pulled a dime from her dress pocket. She put it in the palm of his hand, closed his fingers around it so that it was safe in his fist, and kissed his knuckles in a slobbery smooch. Then she leaned back in her chair, looking at Big John, a little disappointed that the secret wasn't more monumental. She exhaled. Everybody know that. Big John stared at her. What? He thought. What? He also was simultaneously relieved and disappointed, and maybe even a little bit furious at the thought that it was all just a tale told to children, that the adults were all in on it. But why, he wondered, why then do they all go to church? Surely they must believe it. His logical mind spun and spun like the tilt-a-whirl at the feast. He stared at his grandma's undecipherable face as she brushed crumbs from their laps, denoting the finality of her comment. She pulled his face to hers, kissed him on each cheek. He could smell the snuff in her mouth, the olive oil seeping from the pores of her skin. She indicated it was time for him to go home and do his homework. All was well, all was well, all was well. It was no big deal. As he left to walk his bike across the street to his own home, she called after him, a bit too loudly. See, Johnny, you're right. Everybody know that. But remember, God, he no like. So where am I time-wise, guys?
5 more minutes.
5 more minutes, okay. So I got 2 grandmas for you today. It's the same grandma, actually, but this one is at the end of her life. My family's had a hard couple of years, and the most recent thing that happened was my mom had a stroke a few weeks ago. She's doing pretty good. But I think,
I said they should silence their phones.
yeah, if you guys could. And so that's kind of why I chose these grandmothers for today. There's a lot of other things that happen in this book, but I'm watching my mom. You know, what's the difference? It's this whole cycle. But I'm watching my mom try to get her strength back, and I'm thinking about grandchildren and grandmothers and generations and how we do things and how different it is now. So this story is based on my mom's experience with her grandmother, who, when my great-grandmother, her grandmother, was dying of old age, she was quite old, she had each of her grandchildren come and lay in the bed with her, and this went on for weeks. She didn't want her children, she wanted her grandchildren, and they would just accompany her through her days. So this is a little bit from that. Teddy is a teenage girl, she's about 19, and she works at the beauty shop. It's about 1964. Teddy got into the bed, sitting up, and smoothed a tartan blanket over herself and sleeping grandma. Edged in satin, but made of wool, it was the itchy sort of thing probably picked up on clearance at Goldblatt's by someone out shopping for something else entirely. Must have come from one of the aunts. She could hear them all in Grandma's kitchen, running water, tracing back and forth over the linoleum, combating drawers that wouldn't shut properly. Because the aunts lived upstairs or next door or across the street, now that Grandma was sick, they easily spent their days in her kitchen, keeping an eye on things. Teddy had poked her head in to say hi when she come in the house and then hurried to Grandma without stopping to visit. "A spet," they called. "Come here, give us a kiss." But she just waved and hurried to Grandma's room, cracking her gum, rolling her eyes. At just past 4 in the afternoon, and despite the closed bedroom door and the long hallway to the kitchen beyond, espresso and anisette wafted under the door, replacing the outside smells that had come through the window. The smells were so familiar that Teddy hardly noticed them at all, peripheral. What was different than before, though, and what had become hard, and the cold stone of her attention, was the dwindling form of Grandma lying in the 3/4 bed. A changing Grandma, who, weak, always cold and increasingly lonely, had let it be known that she would be comforted only by her grandchildren, and comforted best if they would lie down beside her to keep her warm, to keep her company. A 3/4 bed doesn't leave much room, and Teddy's and Grandma's hips met, just barely, like 2 violins side by side. A family of cracks swept itself diagonally along the ceiling, above one door to the opposite corner, as if someone had slammed that door one time too many. Teddy had never noticed the cracks before, but lying in her grandmother's bed these days opened new perspectives. And when she and her many cousins had spent their childhoods snatching Jordan almonds from the dark kitchen window down below, or sitting in the east-facing front porch of the house, near Grandma's feet to escape the direct sun, Teddy had seldom entered this bedroom before these last weeks. It wasn't that she had been kept out, it was just that she was part of a family in which, under normal circumstances, children had no business in the bedrooms of adults. La Familia had parameters. And though everyone was going mad with foil wallpaper and shag carpets, Grandma's bedroom walls were still cloaked in turn-of-the-century wallpaper. It was dense with violets, ferns, curlicues, so the plain white crown molding above provided visual relief. Teddy drove her eyes round and round the molding square track, listening to the air whistle on its way up Grandma's nose. I'll leave it there. Thank you. Yeah.
Are your stories based on some grandmother you know, whether your own or?
They're based, the grandmother is my great-grandmother to a great extent. Everything is fictionalized though, because it's better that way. But yeah, I was a kid who listened really, really carefully to what the older people said, and I remembered, and I felt it was really